So during the break, you were mentioning the transition on the Jeffersons in the writing process, the sort of changing of the guards. Can you talk about that?
Right. Well, about the third year of about 3 years after I had joined the Jeffersons, Mike and Jay moved up into development, and Ron and Dave, assumed the helm, the executive producership. Now, I don't know whether this was the way they did it at Paramount, but one of the first things that they did was change the way that the writing was done. We slowly, and this was this was with my complete blessing. I was so happy about this. We kind of got rid of the compartmentalization of okay, you take this story idea and go into this room and develop it, and then come out and we'll have these weekly meetings. What we wound up doing was Dick Van Dyke. We would all meet in the big room, a long table, and sit and basically pitch lines, scripts to each other. Now, at first, this was a little bit difficult. It was challenging, especially to a lot of, the older writers, because they weren't used to doing that. They're writers write, actors act, and what we were literally asking them to do is, rather than sit alone, think of a line, write it down, to just say it. And we had a tape going. We had one of the secretaries literally transcribing, like a courtroom, things that were said, and we would actually try to pitch out a script that there wasn't a hierarchy, meaning that, this person was here for 3 years, so they get to speak, and a writer that's just been here for 6 weeks can say nothing. Everybody was on equal. Whoever had something funny to say, say it. Whoever thought of the line, say it. Nobody was better than anybody, and that worked so well. First of all, we got our work done quicker. And I thought that, the scripts were funnier. I also thought that because we got more familiar and at ease with each other because we were in the room with each other all the time. So occasionally, we would stop, we would talk about sports, we would talk about something else, and then we'd get back into it. And that worked a lot better. And that helped also with the transition of the show itself, going from very issue-oriented, or racially charged, or whatever you want to call it, to just funnier, because it's a lot easier for us to be funny than to be emotional, out loud in front of each other. So that was something that was instituted, I guess, about the third year, and that's the way I worked since then. As far as my leaving the Jeffersons, there was the feeling that I had given about all I could give to the Jeffersons, and so I was sort of looking to do something a little bit different. And I don't know how this came about. There were two things at work here, and I am transitioning a little bit to Silver Spoons here, because that was, I think, next. But word was out, and like it always is, when that, I'm looking to do something else, a writer or producer, is looking to do something else. At that time, I was either co-executing or whatever the show. And so I would hear, things from the outside about what was available, and also people on the outside would hear that I was looking. And one of the things that actually got back to me from the outside, as far as future employment, was apparently what was out there was, well, yes, he's funny and he's a decent showrunner, but in looking over my resume, the question is, can he write white? I'm serious. That's actually what the thought was. So can he write white? Now, at the same time, the networks, NBC, wanted to do a show that was based on the movie Arthur. And somebody there really liked Arthur, the movie Arthur, and they thought it'd be a good idea to kind of do a sitcom about, based upon the movie Arthur. Now, this was, of course, television. So, one of the things, so in their infinite wisdom, they said, now, it's Arthur, but, of course, no drinking. I mean, we can't have the guy. Oh well, sure. That's just a tiny element in the movie. So that's what they wanted. But, I'm thinking, well, okay, Arthur acts fairly Caucasian, all right? And then when I'm hearing, they wanted to star Ricky Schroeder, I'm just going, oh, well, that's blindingly white. I can do that. So we got together and wrote, Silver Spoons for Ricky Schroeder. And, that answered any silly questions they had about, can whatever, he can write other races. Oh, okay, he's all right. And we did that. Now I only stayed for the pilot in one episode. I wasn't quite done my tenure of the Jeffersons yet. I didn't think that I could do Silver Spoons, weekly. Dave kind of went and headed up Spoons, and Ron and I went back and did, our final little stint at the Jeffersons. I think we wound up doing, another year or two at the Jeffersons.
All right, well, we'll talk a little bit more about Silver Spoons in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Along the lines of the race issues you're talking about, do you feel like you were subject to racism?
No. I did feel, because everybody, it's such a sensitive topic, that a lot of times race was somehow, interjected in where it had no business being. Why are we, what? There was a lot of days where there were a lot of those days. Some of it I just thought came from just pure naivete. I didn't see, at least not directly to me, I didn't see any of it malicious, mean-spirited. I almost saw, well, can he write white in the same vein as do black girls play with Barbie dolls? It's only kind of, well, I don't think that you're a mean person, but I would hope that there's going to be some day when you're sitting alone in your room and just go, did I really ask him that? I am such an idiot. That it was more along that. And I don't get excised about crap like that. I just I do hope that someday when something like this happens, as long as it's not malicious, you wallow a little bit in your stupidity, and then you've learned something and move on. I'm far too busy, to deal with that. Now, when it impacts employment, I have a problem. With that, because then we have to sit down and talk about it. But
Were you one of the few African American writers rising through the ranks at the time?
At the time, yes. Yeah.
And did you try, when you were responsible for hiring writers, did you try to make it as diverse as you could?
I did. I did with both. Race and with gender. We tried. I wanted our writing staffs to look like the audience did at the Jefferson, and Dr. Nishin. So we would bring, we would bring more women. We would bring more black. Now, one thing, and again, sad to say, I was a stickler for qualifications. I wasn't going. I'd bring them on. I'm not going to carry you, and that was a problem from time to time, because it wasn't anyone's fault necessarily, but there was very few quality scripts coming from. First, it was very, not as nearly as many women then as there was today, even trying to do this, and there weren't as many blacks, trying to do this, and a lot of times their scripts, would reflect that, that you haven't really worked this yet. They haven't been exposed to that long, and it would take time. But what I would try to do is I look for potential. I didn't mind carrying a little bit if sooner or later, I could put you down and you could actually stand there. If you're gonna fall over, I'm not picking you up again. But we really did try to do. We really did try to do that. Mm-hmm.
It seems like you almost have a colorblind writing style. Like, is that possible? Is it?
I try.
Yeah.
Again, because I do believe it's possible, to make everyone, to entertain everyone. You don't have to, target anyone. Well, at least not then. I mean, I don't know what the polarization of television today has set that back, but I don't try to say, okay, this is really going to make women laugh, or this is really going to crack up short guys. It's wheelchair humor today. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try to make everybody laugh. I'm going to make people laugh at themselves. I'm going to try to make people laugh at each other, not mean-spiritedly, But, that's the way that's the way I think you should go about it. Growing up, two of my favorite comedians of all time, believe it or not, were Laurel and Hardy. And I have Laurel and Hardy stuff to watch these two guys, and I must, from the time, I'd say that I was in my 20s, when you could actually start getting stuff on DVD and the old stuff, Hal Roaches and all that stuff, to now. I would watch their comedies, and not once did I ever sit there and just go, well, those two white boys are funny. Those are the two funniest white boys. I can't think like that. Just like another Richard Pryor, I love. But I don't sit there and just go, he's the funniest black comedian. Like, come on, really? It doesn't need to be there. There are places where it does need to be. Almost none of them are funny. But, in terms of comedy, really? Oh, do we have to do that? I don't think we have to do that. I have proof that audience on the Jeffersons will always prove to me that you don't have to do that. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Before we move on to Silver Spoons, we just want to touch on a couple of shows that you wrote, just one script for. Checking In was the Jeffersons spinoff. What's your memory of writing that?
Checking In, it was the network's first attempt to give Marla Gibbs her own show. I did not do writing on that specifically. I was kind of on loan, the week or two of the pilot, to do punch-ups and things for it if, need be. What that afforded me was the opportunity to watch how pilots were actually done. I kind of selfishly used that as more of a learning experience for me when I would sit there and just watch. But I don't recall doing any serious writing on Checking In. I just watched, how it was all done, and watched the, interaction with the network. It was a lot different, obviously, than the day-to-day runnings, of an established show. So, it was a learning experience for everybody. That was Mike and Jay, who headed that up, I believe.
And then you did an episode of Different Strokes. You recall that?
Yeah, I don't. That was much earlier, and I think that again was on loan. One thing that I was actually had a reputation for was that I was fast, and if someone needed a script and someone needed a show, if something happened and the script they had for some reason they couldn't produce, or it wasn't ready, or something like, and they needed something quickly, many times I could actually do this fairly quickly, could write up something and get it going kind of, and that's, I think, was more of the impetus of Different Strokes than someone saying, hey, we'd love to have a Michael Moye episode for Different Strokes. So I did go over there for a while. I do believe I was on the Jeffersons, but still fairly new to the Jeffersons when I did my episode of Different Strokes.
And then you wrote one episode of Sanford.
Yeah.
You said earlier that your dad sort of reminded you of him. Did you bring any of your dad in?
Meeting, yeah, that was fun. I actually, one of regrets was not being there to do Sanford and Son. Because seeing Red, seeing the guys that he would bring from the days on the Chitlin circuit, the Skillets, the Leroys, all of his old guys that they used to do the albums with, reminded me so much of my father's friends, the restaurant in New Haven. Also the stories that these guys would tell about what it was like. See, now that's racism. See, this is why stuff like this makes me crazy. I mean, and I don't know how topical you want to get, but one thing that made me crazy, for instance, last week, and I'm sure you heard about this, there was actually like a furor brought up because apparently right after Gabby won her gold medal, they played a commercial for an NBC show that had the vet show that actually had like a monkey. And somebody actually said, we're upset because right after Gabby won this, they did a commercial that had a monkey in it. And so what? So NBC is racist now? And I'm sitting there going, you got to be kidding me. Because I watched that. And you could sit me there for 100 years and I would have never made that connection. So this is a show about a vet who happens to apparently have a monkey mascot. In order for them to have done this, now think about this. First, they would have had to have known Gabby's going to win the gold medal, way ahead of time, so we could load this commercial and have it waiting, So she wins the gold medal. Okay, she won. Run the monkey bit. So they run the monkey bit. I said, so now, what in their minds? They run the monkey bit after that. So now what are they saying to each other? Are they laughing evilly, twisting their mustaches, going, man, are we really overshadowed that gold medal thing? We really ruined it. She's probably in the back room crying. We really ruined her life now for absolutely no reason. And apparently we also developed this show, this entire sitcom, solely for the purpose of running this commercial at the very time that we knew she was going to win the gold medal, just to ruin her life. We're NBC. And I'm just, oh God. Here we are in an age that they call the information age, where there's more. I said, we have less to do now, apparently, than we did like 400 years ago. Because in my mind, the stuff that Red had to live through, having to not be able to stay at the hotel he just performed at because they didn't allow black people. In that sort of more to the point, if we're really going to throw the racism, isn't that more than just NBC throwing up a commercial that happened to have a monkey in it because the show is about a veterinary office? I can't stand this kind of stuff, you know. But I would have loved to have listened, you know, to Red, to all of, you know, to his associates, Lawanda, all of these guys to sit and talk about those days, for which I understand they did, you know, quite a bit because, you know, that was their life. You know, I'd love to hear that stuff. I wish that they would have recorded that stuff. I mean, that a wealth of information. But yes, doing Sanford, you know, I happened to have an idea for Sanford that I pitched to them, and at the same time, they actually again needed something quick, you know, that particular week. So, you know, I was, you know, offered up for hire for that week. But that was, you know, that was fun for me. I said, oh, yeah, you know, Red Fox is doing my script. You know, I was very excited about that.
That's great.
Yeah.
All right, so Silver Spoons. Tell us what the original premise of the show was and if it changed during the genesis of it.
Well, like I said, the network wanted to do Arthur, you know, without the alcohol, and they apparently had Ricky Schroeder, who, you know, I think that movie, what is it called, The Champion or something?
Champ.
Something like
Yeah.
that, Champ. Yeah, they had him under contract, so they wanted to, you know, do something with him, and, you know, so they combined those two things, and they came to Ron, Dave, and I, and that's kind of how the idea, you know, of Silver Spoons, you know, was born. Like I said, I did it more to prove that, you know, I could do that kind of humor, if that was a kind of humor, that I could do that as well as, you know, doing, you know, the Jeffersons and Good Times and Sanford and Different Strokes, and so, you know, that's what I did. One of the coolest things I about the week of at least one of the episodes that when I did get to meet Mr. T, who was in his prime then. That was a thrill for me. I thrill very easily, apparently, you know, but I did get to meet him, and you know, it went really well. You know, the network liked it; they picked it up. I had sort of remembered my experiences doing checking in about dealing with networks, dealing with pilots. That was my first real time dealing one-on-one, you know, with networks like that. So
Tell us a little bit about the process of selling a pilot to a network.
well, it's very similar to what, you know, is to selling an episode of a series to me, you know, except they had, you know, much nicer offices and really good coffee. But we went, you know, we would go over, and if the idea was an in-house idea, you know, like it was for them, they would ask us they would tell us what they were looking for, and we would try to put something together. And what I'd like to do is every step of the way, you know, just so that we wouldn't go too far with something that they didn't like at all, you know, and just continually bring them up to date, you know, with what we were doing. You know, this was their idea, so, you know, we didn't have to worry about whether or not they were serious about this, or, you know, whether or not anyone was going to change their mind. This came from them as opposed to, you know, an idea that we would pitch to them. And so as we developed this, you know, we would try to keep them, you know, apprised as much as we could. And what Ron and Dave and I used to do, which apparently, again, a lot of people did not do, was rather than sit and submit a script to them and let them read it, we would practically perform it for them. We would sit there with them there, and almost verbatim, line for line, pitch the script so that they were in their mind, they were actually watching the episode, the pilot, being performed in front of them. And we actually found that worked a lot better because there was very little, left to interpretation, and there's very little left to their imagination, which I'm sure you've heard 100 times. The last thing you want to do is leave something up to a network executive's imagination. You do not want to do that. So we made sure that everything was basically spoon-fed to them. And then, along asking, this is okay? Is this okay? This is okay. And that's how we did it, particularly with an idea like Silver Spoon's an in-house idea. They did like it. They brought in Ricky, who at that time was 8, 9 years old. That was my first time I actually got to see the casting process too. And once we did write the pilot and watching them cast Ricky with a bunch of other actors, was fascinating to me, because you got to see, I got to see, my scenes, interpreted 50 different ways by 50 different actors, which was very interesting to me. Again, still as I'm watching characterization. I'm watching the characters that they bring to the table, these actors, and it actually was fascinating, to watch that process. That was the first time I've seen that.
Were you there when they cast Joel Higgins?
Yes.
What did he bring to the table?
Joel was very funny. It almost seemed like he almost would defer to Ricky, and you'd sit there and you would wonder, well, who's the kid here? Because a lot of the guys, and this is just their nature, I suppose, would come on strong. I mean, they would do the funny lines, and as you remember, you might recall, we played this character as very childlike himself. But, a lot of the actors in casting, and I guess they couldn't help it, would come across naturally as, I'm the dominant male in the room. I may be silly, but clearly, you're the child. And Joel, from the very beginning, almost seemed like another kid. And that's what they wanted, and he didn't have to be directed to do that, because there were a few actors that they liked, but they didn't quite do that, so we would give them notes to do that, which to a lot of them meant, raise my voice an octave higher, okay. And they would do the exact same thing. They would just, talk like Richard Simmons, which got really creepy, when talking to Rich. So, but Joel just naturally was a peer, a buddy, and it was fun. It was interesting to watch that.
Well, how much did the economic climate of the time play into the premise of the show? So the Reagan era.
I tried not to look at it. I never do that. It's funny, and so many things get by me, that when someone tells me afterwards, what was playing, what was at play out in the real world, I go, oh yeah. So clearly I'm a moron, but I just looked at it from, I just sort of I didn't go far outside the story itself. I just had enough trouble with, Arthur without alcohol, and tried to make that work without having the guy seem like, oh, well, this is a clinically insane man, and having to just sort of walk that narrow line. I didn't go for much outside that. Now, what reflection it had on the times, if it did, I mean, maybe even the movie did. I don't know. I never try to think about that, because then I would have a tendency to try to make the actual play more than it is. Then I would feel the need, oh, well, I didn't get that at first. A lot of people may not get that, so let me try to make them see what I'm trying to do here is try to be more of a reflection almost. And I don't want to do that. I would let the people who are much smarter than me make that association, because I'm apparently incapable of doing that. But I would rather them do it than me try to force it.
I know you only stayed with the show for the pilot, but did you have a favorite episode? Did you stay in touch?
I didn't. By that time we were still in a lot of production with the Jeffersons. I didn't watch a lot. I didn't, like I said, the Mr. T thing, I was there for. I did not watch very many of the episodes. I wasn't involved in the development of the episodes. It's just that, Dave went and, took care of that, and we went, back to the Jeffersons.
And then the next show you worked on was called It's Your Move.
Yes.
And you created that with Ron Levitt again. So what's the premise of that show?
All right. That was, I had to take a little step back. That was after we had done the Jeffersons and were put in development. Development, as you know, technically is where, your sole job is to sit there and come up with ideas for pilots and do them. In reality, we sit and we watch TV. We just order in food from exotic places, and then a few hours a day we actually work. It's Your Move. If you remember, and this, again, reflecting the times, ironically, we tried, because of the times, what we tried to do was come up with a show, come up with a premise that really, we really wanted to do the opposite of what was popular. That's another thing that I'm known for. When the world marches in this direction, instinctively I go in this direction. At this point, a lot of the Lear type morality plays, that was over, that era was over, and we were all surfing the crest of the wave of Cosby. And all of the shows as we go, and I didn't have a problem with Cosby. I think there's there's an idea out there that I did not like Bill Cosby, which is the Bill Cosby Show, which is actually not true. What I did not like were shows that were trying to be the Bill Cosby Show. And as you know, television being somewhat imitative at the time, they weren't hearing anything but networks, but shows that were like the Bill Cosby Show, because that's what everyone wanted. They wanted a hit like Bill Cosby. We, in development then, knew what we had to do was try to do a show that was sort of unlike Bill Cosby. You will hear this again when it comes to It's Your Move. I mean, Married with Children. And so what we wanted to do, so we tried to develop a show where the child in the show, where the kid in the show had parents basically wrapped around their finger. This wasn't going to be a show like Cosby where, the parents, of course, know everything. That the kids may try to fool them, but in the end, the parents know, and we got you. Don't you know, at one time we were your age? And, every once in a while you'll run into a kid who is actually, a born con man and really can pull the wool over, the parents' eyes. We wanted to do a show about that kid. And we remember from Silver Spoons a kid named Jason Bateman, from Silver Spoons, who we thought had that natural ability, he could play that character, he could be that guy. And so we did a show about a kid who basically ran his high school not through thuggery, but by the fact that he actually was pretty much a genius. He might not have been a genius with all A's, but I mean, clearly this kid was going to be a politician. Clearly this kid, when he grew up, was going to be a senator. Because by the time he was done manipulating, and having kids work for him, he could do whatever he wanted. I mean, yeah, he could have all A's. He could also have his principal's driver's license suspended. I mean, he could do things. I mean, he could just sit back in his chair, from his chair, and basically be the Godfather without any guns, without any threats, without any blood. He was that kid. And that was sort of the seed of It's Your Move. And we gave him, a mother that he doted over, a single mom, that he would dote over and protect. And because she did need that in his mind. The hook was that the guy that moved across the hall from his mother was an adult version of what that kid used to be. He was the same kind, he had that same kind of mind. And also, and liked his mom, and wanted a relationship with his mom, which made the kid crazy. And it was just sort of a battle of wits between, a 12-year-old and a 30-year-old, over the affections of mom and their basic abuse of each other, and it was a very tough show to write because we had to constantly have these guys, try to outwit each other. So it was one of these where you almost would write backwards. We write from the resolution, who won that week, and then say, write it backwards. Up to that point, it was, my favorite show that I had ever done. A lot more work went into it than normally because a lot of the story twists and turns were a lot more complex. But it was, it was my favorite. During the casting of that show, by the way, is when we first ran into David Garrison, who was phenomenal. He played the love interest. He played the quote, a grown-up con man across the hall.
What did you see in David that you liked so much? You clearly used him again
He could
later.
He is the most talented actor that I had run into. I mean, as far as versatile, as far as things that he could do. I remember one specific thing that just blew me away. There was an episode that we did where, Jason Bateman had done something that caused a rift, yet another rift in their relationship. It was during the holidays. He had arranged something so that it caused a fight between his mother and Garrison. And Garrison's character, I believe his name was Norman, was trying to woo the mother back. And in one little sad attempt, he stood outside her window and played a Christmas song on the harmonica in the snow, and it was just a little, it wasn't much, it was just a little bit that we were just throwing in, just showing the little pathetic attempts he was making to win back the affections. And we had brought in, at least contacted, a guy, because we're going to lay the, song, and I think a sad version of Jingle Bells, whatever it was, or some song. We're going to lay it in later. And over the weekend, that weekend when we were rehearsing, Monday when we went through a run-through, because I think it was a Thursday to Wednesday show, and we got to that part, Garrison actually pulled out a harmonica and played this song. Over the weekend, he never played the harmonica before. He actually learned how to play this on a harmonica. That absolutely blew me away, that he would do this. This isn't $100 million movie, a little sitcom. And, you took the time to do this. As long as I'm working, you're working, buddy. As soon as I saw something, that, even if we had to cut that scene later for time, I'll never forget that. So that's, how we ran into to Garrison. But, the show was picked up for 17 episodes. It was very funny. We're reading the fan mail. The fan mail was split almost 50-50 from kids writing, saying at last there's a show that sort of reflects us the way we really behave, whereas the other 50% were parents writing, this is ridiculous. No, you're writing a show, kids don't do that. We'd never let them do that. There's no way that a kid can get over on an adult like this. You should be ashamed of yourselves for promoting that. And it was very, very funny, but, the adults won out, and, after 17, the show was over.
Are any of the stories or the characters or anything on that show from your life?
Not really. Not really. I always wish that I could have been, that kid. But no, I can't say that they were a direct pull, from my life. Some of them were more traditional characters. He always had Jason's character always had the idiot sidekick. I think in this one his name was Eli, or something like that. But no, this was just done, just for flat out humor's sake, and and to see how complex we can make the stories.
And why do you think it didn't get picked up again after those first 17?
I think that I think that the network got a lot of calls saying, you can't air shows like this because, it makes you're showing us parents as imbeciles that, our children can have us wrapped around. My kid, he likes this. You can't do this. I don't know why he likes it. I mean, he's never pulled anything over on me. In the meantime, kids got parties and girls in his room. But, I think that's why. I think that the network, got, the ratings weren't bad, but I think that the networks got a lot of, negative response in the form of mail and phone calls. That's when we knew we were on the right track. If we would elicit that kind of response, we knew we were on the right track, and the second swing, and actually the third, but we nailed it with Married, because that,
right.
That's again what we were going for.
Right. After that, you worked on 227. So
Right.
Can you tell us how that came about?
227 was originally a stage play that Norman. And I hadn't run into Norman at this time in quite a while. But at this point, he kind of reached out and, told me, invited me to see the play. And he wanted to develop a show sort of based on this. And this was Marla's second time at bat, as far as getting, a pilot, and Norman thought that this would be a good, vehicle for her, adapting it to television. So, he brought me, on board, and I kind of adapted the play to television. And that's sort of how that came. This was not my idea, it was somebody else's idea, but I kind of developed it for television.
And what was your involvement with the show? Did you just do the pilot?
Just did the pilot. This was going to be, this I had found out was going to be, another issue, more issue-oriented, social type of comedy, and I wasn't really, again, interested in, changing the world, through sitcoms. And, but, I was willing to do the pilot, and that became a bit more of a struggle, than I wanted. and never really saw eye to eye on what the show should be. So, because it wasn't my idea, I didn't have much invested in it, and I just decided, this idea, this should be what you guys want it to be. And,
So
I
what
sort of left it at that, and, took my name off, and, worked through went through a pseudonym.
So you worked as an alias. What was the alias?
C.J. Banks, I believe.
And why was that?
CJ was my theater teacher, and his first name, and Banks was just the name that I pulled. Yeah.
So what was the original premise, and do you feel like you added anything to it?
The original premise, as I recall, was I think this took place it was in mid-Atlantic, Baltimore, Pittsburgh. It was something like that, where a lot of life there, and which is true. There were row houses, if you're familiar with that part of the country, very Baltimore, a lot of row houses. And in the summer, particular, everybody is on the stoop, rather than sitting in the house boiling, in the heat and humidity. People come out on the stoop, and it's just several blocks long as a family is on stoops, and, life kind of happens out there. And that was the venue, which was very unique venue. As a matter of fact, that's what drew me to this, because I have relatives there, and I'm privy to this. Unlike Good Times with Cabrini Green, which I didn't really know a lot about, this I knew about, at least the life there. And, that's what brought me into it. And, of course, the political nature, again, made me step back from it. But I tried to be as true to, because that's really what I cared about the most, and I'm interested in the most, was just that life. That was a slice of life that you really didn't see on television at all. And, I just thought that was interesting enough. Again, falling back on character, the array of different characters you would see on these stoops, I always thought was enough in and of itself, to sort of hold, a pilot. Didn't necessarily need, the political, but, a lot of others, wanted it, and that's, I guess, the way it went.
Talk a little bit about working with Marla Gibbs again.
Marla and I were very different people. Marla was very socially aware, very socially conscious, and she wanted that reflected in her work. Because that was not my priority. My priority was making people laugh. It did not set itself up for the smoothest environment, working environment. So we just had to agree to disagree, because there wasn't going to be a meeting of the minds. This wasn't one of these that I think we could fix. I didn't want to be, kind of sort of funny, and she didn't want to be kind of sort of socially aware. So we had to, we had to go our separate ways there.
One of the other actresses on the show was Jackie Harry.
Yes.
Did you get a sense right away that she was going to be sort of a breakout star from the show?
I did, because I always think that if you're going to watch a sitcom, you're watching a sitcom for the funny people. And I'm actually glad about that, because I've always, I stated before, I always think if you're watching a sitcom, to learn lessons, to get involved in being socially aware. I don't know if I don't know if you're. I don't know if that's the right. Let's just say I don't know if that's the right tack to take. I don't know. So I always think then the comedy, what they used to call the comedy relief, that's where people are going to go. That's where people. That's where people are going to go. And Jack. Watch Jack K develop that character. I mean, you don't have to be any kind of genius to know. This is what's gonna be the breakout character.
How was the character created?
As the comedy relief, really. I mean, I think she was very. If you took the bare bones of, say, like Walona on Good Times, and just kind of spiked it just a little bit more, now the voice and all of that was her, and I think that's what really. I think that's what really sent the character way over the top, as far as popularity, was that little voice and things that she did. But I all I wanted to bring, was I thought just much needed relief. And it was honestly, I wish I could say something that was brilliant, but it was literally no more than that. I mean, at some point, somebody's got to take the pie to the face, and that's what she was.
Now they attempted to do a spin-off of a show for her with an episode of 227. Were you involved with that?
No,
you weren't.
No, I was long gone at that point.
Do you have a sense of why maybe that pilot didn't get picked up? Why it didn't work?
Well, okay, sometimes especially when the character. Is a little bit over the top. I think once that character now, second, becomes the featured character, it becomes too much. It really becomes, it's like the Krispy Kreme donut analogy. When it's like 100% sugar, it's not good anymore. It's fine, but when you just when you do all the time, you got to just take a break from it, And I think when you give the comedy relief the featured role suddenly, it's not as good, because then, I mean, who's going to be the comedy relief for that person? I mean, that's just going to be insane then, So that's probably why. Again, I'm going. This is just pure conjecture on my part, but I just thought it might have been too much sugar. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, and then we move on to Married with Children.
Yes. We move
so
on.
Describe how that came about.
Okay, this is if you ask 100 different people that were around at the time, the development of Married with Children, you will hear 100 different stories. This has become like the biggest urban legend since like Midnight Mary. It's very funny. I was there, and I've been told, oh no, that's not how it happened. Okay, but so I'll have to preface this by saying, well, the way I recall is we were in development. Love Connection had just gone off, and we saw Roseanne Barr doing her domestic goddess comedy routine, which was very, very funny, very, very unique. And maybe a couple weeks earlier, we're big fans of Sam Kinison. And we just saw Sam Kinison do, one of his, nutty, screaming, I guess at the time people would say anti-woman bits. And I don't know which one of us it was. But the idea was, wouldn't it be funny if that character was married to that character? That, in a nutshell, is how I remember Married, basically the conception of Married with Children. I have heard this story retold literally 100 different ways, 100 different people, but that's the way I remember it.
So is the rumor that Sam Kinison was considered for the part, is that rumor or is that true?
As far as I'm concerned, it's a rumor. Now, if this had happened, and if this well could have happened, they just did not tell me. Because that sounds like something that a network would do. It sounds exactly like something. If you say, I saw this character, I saw this, that for them to run out and try to get those people sounds exactly like something they would do. I would not put it. But if they did, I wasn't aware of it because, again, character with me, I'm looking at what they were doing rather than who they were. So with that idea, about the Sam Kinison character married to the Roseanne Barr character, we sort of kicked that around. Now, we had absolutely no intention of pitching this to anyone because we knew at that time we were still Cosbying. If anything, by that time, the Cosby Show, had become so huge that they would not have even let you in their offices if you weren't pitching a show with, white collar leads with, 19 children and all that. And this was so counter to everything that was being brought up on the networks. We had no intention of doing this. We were really doing this for our own amusement, and maybe just saying, well, maybe someday, when this is over, when we have moved on to whatever the next trend is going to be, maybe we could try this and this was what we wanted to keep in our back pocket. Now, the next step was very, very creepy in that almost immediately, Garth Anseer, who we knew from NBC, he was involved in It's Your Move, and he had become an executive. He moved from NBC to, at that time, the network that was going to be Fox. And he was a big fan of ours because he knew that we did do counterculture stuff. We did do, unusual stuff. He came to us, and the first thing he said was, hey, we're trying to put together this network. We want you guys to be a part of it. We want you guys to do something for it because, what's going to set this network apart is that we want to do shows that you wouldn't find on other networks. We wanted to do different shows. So you come up with something that fits that bill, let us know. And we didn't even let him, we said, we got something now that fits that bill. And we pitched the idea. And at that time, it was just a very bare bones, idea. And characters didn't have names. We did mention, the Roseanne Barr thing, the Sam Kinison thing, and just so that he would have an idea of what we were, the relationship that people were talking about. And he liked it. And so we had the impetus to actually now start fleshing it out. And it's funny, we found out while we were fleshing it out that we had to do this quickly because, well, when are you guys going to need this? It's like, now? What we found out late.
I'm going to stop you there, and we're going to change tapes,
Okay.
and then we'll pick this up again.